Let's go with the abuse because I think it sets up what made me so vulnerable.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because I think that's really important for a lot of people. It's amazing, how many people admitted to me that they had been abused before they became witnesses.
Yeah.
And these were, while I was a witness, people, my friends, almost, I'd say about 80-90% of my friends had been abused before they became witnesses. And this sets up a particular dynamic for the love bombing. And I think that's important to bring out.
Excellent.
My first 10 years of life was extremely abusive. We were not Jehovah's Witnesses, but in the first 10 years I experienced a lot of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. When I was 11, I had been living with my father. At 11, I went to live with my mother, who was studying with the witnesses. So that was my first introduction to the witnesses. And during the 1-year period where I was living with her boyfriend, who was also studying with the witnesses, was sexually abusing me. And there was a lot of physical and emotional abuse going on there, too. And as a consequence of her finding out about this sexual abuse, I was sent into foster care. Now, I'd had 1 year of going to meetings and going from door to door and the witness life. And I was sent into foster care, and I was not allowed there to speak to witnesses or have any contact with them. So here I was in an environment where I had no contact with the witnesses, but the interesting thing was that I continued to behave like a witness and to believe that if I did that, then God would approve of me. So I went to school in grade 8, 9, and 10, not participating in extracurricular activities, not standing up and singing the anthem, not participating in any of the holidays. So basically doing all of the things that witness kids did. And the interesting thing was that there were a few witness kids in the school who didn't have a clue who I was, saw me sitting out in the hallway like they did, and never approached me. Never talked to me, never asked why I was doing all the same things they were doing. And it was the most bizarre situation. And yet, here I was doing all of this and not having any contact with witnesses at all. And I look back and I think, wow, that 1 year in a child, 11 years old, was strong enough to implant that for 3 more years. At 16, I went back to live with my mother, and within a year I was baptized. And another year I was married, and a couple of more years after that had 2 children. And the marriage itself was imposed, and I would even say arranged by my mother. She was very anxious to have me married and out of the house, and I guess so she wouldn't be responsible for me anymore. But also there's tremendous fear on her part that I would have sex outside of marriage. So there was, don't want to break that rule. So she got me married as quickly as possible. And to somebody who was baptized a week before I married him. So a really new convert. And he was very enthusiastic, and within a few years rose up through the ranks and became a ministerial servant and eventually an elder. And one of the things about any authoritarian group is that the people at the bottom have no power, and children and women have no power. And since he was moving up through the ranks, ministerial servant and elder, he had power, and he used it to control us, to abuse us. He beat the children, and of course the explanation or excuse for justification for that was that it was Bible-based, that he should beat his children. But his beating involved also kicking and punching. And they were little at the time. And I would try to, get in there and pull him out of the room. And sometimes I was able to do it, and sometimes I wasn't. And I didn't like it after growing up in that kind of environment. It was really hard to stay there. But one of the things, when I went back when I was 16, here I had been a child who had been abused badly most of my young life. I had been shipped off to foster home and had no contact with my brothers or any of my family. And when I got back at 16, I was welcomed with open arms into the congregation. It was like they remembered me, and I think for the first time in my life I had a sense that somebody cared that I was around. And that's a really powerful drug to somebody who's been abused and abandoned. And what I found with a lot of people I knew is they also had abusive backgrounds. And by joining, by no means not all witnesses have this kind of background, but a lot do. And by joining something like the witnesses, or any cult for that matter, getting this sense that people care about you, that you're special because God has blessed this group, that individuals, like when I went in, the first meeting I went to, one woman grabbed my hand and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I've missed you. I remember you so well." It was just like somebody finally covering me warm blanket and saying, "You're home. Welcome." And it was like water to, a man in the desert. It was wonderful. And that was such a strong hook for me, and I think it is for other people too. And it's a hook that keeps people there. Because even though once you become a full-fledged member, a lot of that disappears, there's always, once you've had it, there's the hope that if you can be good enough, you'll get it again. And it's only because you've got all these negative thoughts in your head and you're not doing everything perfectly that you're not getting it. So it keeps you working harder and harder to strive to get that sense of acceptance and belonging. And this is an abuse dynamic. And this is why women stay in abusive relationships. It's also why people stay in abusive cults, because there's this constant kind of dangling the carrot that if you're good enough, you will get everything that you've been promised. And unfortunately, you never get it. You're on the treadmill, and you're running and running, and you're told you're still not good enough, and so which keeps you working harder and harder. And it becomes it's extremely manipulative, but it's a dynamic that is really difficult to break out of because you don't realize what it is, especially if as a young child, that's all you ever knew. And so for people who were raised as witnesses from childhood, to them this is perfectly normal. And we gravitate towards what's normal. And that's why I think a lot of people from abusive backgrounds will enter into cults, because to them this is normal, which is kind of sad. From there, so I'm married. I have a couple of children. My husband is an elder. He's abusing us. He's using the Bible to demand sexuality on demand. I was trying to deal with the abuse from my childhood, and I had a husband who was abusing me sexually. It was overwhelming. I became extremely depressed and suicidal. I felt like there was no way out. When I married this man, 2 weeks later, I realized I'd made a horrible mistake. But because they don't believe in divorce, I was stuck, so I tried to make the best of it. And I stayed for 15 years and just got more and more depressed until daily I was thinking about dying. I even started making arrangements, talking to people, will you take care of my children if something happens to me? I was kind of trying to set it up so that I knew who my ex-husband would marry, so that they would have a mother. I talked to people and in case he didn't marry, like, will you be there for my kids? And I was working on making plans to commit suicide. And I just realized I didn't want to die. I wanted to be free. But the only way to be free was to either die or commit adultery. That was the only way away from this man. And I just knew I couldn't go to the elders with this. He was one of the elders. And my experience with men to that point had been really negative. So there was no basis for me to believe that they were going to support me. So I actually met somebody, and I had a sexual experience with him that turned into a rape. And being the victim and sexual abuse survivor, I felt it was my fault. I didn't even recognize it was rape for about 3 years when I started doing some research on date rape, and then it was like, oh. But it took me a year to tell my husband that I had committed adultery and that I wanted a divorce. And he said, oh, I'll forgive you. We could go on and it's like, I'm not going through all of this just to be forgiven. I want out. But being out, getting a divorce meant I also had to leave the religion, because I didn't see how I could stay and be a witness and get the divorce. So my option was get the divorce, then he's free. Another big, huge dynamic in here was that my husband was always threatening that if I didn't provide sex on demand, he would commit adultery and it would be my fault. And this whole issue of blood guilt that they instill in people, that if a wife does not fulfill her sexual obligation to her husband, if he commits adultery, then she's responsible. So forget his responsibility in this. She winds up being responsible. And therefore, God will condemn her. So to let him off the hook, in my very warped kind of thinking at the time, I figured, okay, I'll commit adultery, then he's free to remarry, and then I won't be guilty if he commits adultery. And that way I only have my own blood on my own head and not his. So this to me, other than suicide, seemed like a rather reasonable alternative. So that's the route I went. And then once I told him I had committed adultery, it was bringing the elders in, which was a humiliating experience. The questions were in detail. When I finally told them that it had turned into a rape, they didn't believe me. And they said, well, if it was rape, then you're not free to marry. And it's like, well, I was there. I did, go down this route. And it was just really awkward and uncomfortable. A lot of details they really didn't. All they needed to know was that it happened. And I wanted my divorce. I got my divorce, and then, of course, had to leave the witnesses too. One of the other things that, in doing it this way, he knew that I was going to tell the elders that I had committed adultery. Hey, here he is. He's an elder in the congregation. Everybody's looking up to him, and like he's counseling people on their marital lives. And outwardly, I made it look like we had the ideal family. And people would say, oh, you have such a wonderful family. When I get married, I want a family just like yours. And I would want to be sick, but it's like, oh, wow, thank you very much. And again, that pretense and not showing people what was really inside of me, because that would have been totally inappropriate, not allowed, to show that I was having problems, severe problems. I did try talking to some elders' wives about it and about my past abuse, and they were like, oh, well, I've never heard of such a thing, and I don't know what to say to you. And there was no support, no help. At the time, people were not allowed to go for therapy. We did try that route eventually, And my husband, after the second time, went, "There's something wrong with her. Fix her and everything will be okay." Which in his terms meant, as long as I get sex on demand, it's like, no problem. So just get her to change her mind. So I went for the divorce, and that was it. Actually got the divorce quite easily. And then my mother stopped talking to me. My family stopped talking to me. He remarried, and my family went to his wedding. Wouldn't talk to me, but they all went to his wedding. I was devastated. When they told me I was disfellowshipped, I almost fainted. And during this whole procedure of committees and the disfellowshipping thing, my husband admitted to them his abuse of me. And I think what really hurt was that for 15 years he had been abusing me behind everyone's back and keeping it a secret. And he knew that I was going to go and talk to the elders, so he actually stepped down as elder. Because I think he knew that if they found out all of this, they would have to put him down. So the cover-up for him was that I'm spending more time with my family. So, how noble of him. And then I was disfellowshipped, and then everybody for him was like, "Oh, you poor thing." So he got all of the support and the empathy and everything. And I was left out there drifting. I made one sin in 15 years and was disfellowshipped. He'd been going on for 15 years and got nothing. Not even a slap on the wrist. And that really hurt. The other thing, too, with the way the organization works is that since I left, I was the bad guy. He wound up being the good guy, and because he stayed, and as a result married another witness who happened to have 2 daughters who were the same ages apart as mine, or ours were. So it was like God has replaced what was taken away from you. So you've been blessed. So the faithful wind up being rewarded, the unfaithful wind up being expelled, and nobody knows the truth. That my one-time mistake, which turned out to be a rape, wound up being, reason for disfellowshipping. And his 15 years, there's not even a note in his files about it. Because I went back about 5 years later to ask about being reinstated, because I was just so lost out in the world. I figured, okay, I'll go back and at least I'll have some friends once I'm reinstated. And I was treated so badly by the elder. And he was one of the elders on the committee, and he says there's nothing in his file about anything that he said. So, a total whitewash. And I was treated so badly, I think, because if I went back, they knew I would tell the truth, which meant that I would be sitting there telling them that an elder had been abusing his wife severely and his children while he was an elder, and nobody did anything about it. So it's easier to make sure that I never go back. And I called different congregations, and I got the same, no, very, very nasty responses from people, because I'm a real threat to their version of the truth, that he's a nice guy, never did anything wrong, and didn't deserve what happened. Interestingly, his second wife has done the exact same thing, committed adultery so she could get away from him. And that just happened this past year. And I guess she realized what I'd done and decided to take the same route. My children have suffered through all of this. They suffered for all the things they lost while being witnesses, growing up in school and being apart from the other children, not being able to celebrate birthdays and Christmas and other holidays, just not being able to participate in things in school. My youngest daughter I think would have been an extremely talented musician if she'd ever had lessons, But there was no time with that between meetings and service and studying and everything. So that's a huge loss. My older daughter is married now and has a daughter of her own, and she's beginning to celebrate all of the holidays and everything with her daughter. And she says, I'm so sad. I missed out on all of these things that just are fun. Just nothing horrible about them. And yet as a witness, you're not allowed. So that's painful to listen to, my children talk about what they've missed because of it. And I think there's some anger on their part that, why did I put them through that? And as well, I was just as caught in it as you were. And yeah, it was wrong. It was a terrible way to live. But we're all free now and we can make other choices for our lives, which is really nice. But, I look at them and the damage. And like they stopped going to meetings when they were 8 and 12. Actually a little older, probably 9 and 13. But even as young adults, they still have a harder time integrating into society and knowing what real family and what real caring is, because what you get in the witnesses is very superficial and what is allowed and very controlled, as long as there's conditions on love. And so they're still struggling with some of that in knowing that love is unconditional.